Hey gang, what's going on? I am here in Eureka, Illinois today, and we are here to see the grave of a pretty famous crew member of a pretty famous, I'm going to say, ghost plane. And we have to thank Roger Callender, who is an Instagram friend and viewer on our channel, for tipping me off to this. I knew this story, but I just didn't know that this man was buried here, one of these famous crewmates here, and we're at the Oleo Township Cemetery here in Eureka. Looks like an old cemetery as we pass through the gates, and we're in. In World War II, the B-24 Liberator was one of the powerhouse weapons, along with the B-17 Flying Fortress, to deliver the bomb loads across Europe and other places. We're going to be talking about one specific B-24 today, a B-24D Delta called the Lady Be Good. And I said it was a ghost plane. It indeed was a ghost plane. It's a remarkable story. This was the battle over the Mediterranean, Italy, and North Africa. So let's take a walk. Let's talk about the story, and we're going to find the grave of one of the young men who served aboard that ship. A lot of old gravestones here. We're starting in the older section of the cemetery. To give us some time to walk, we've got a little bit of a walk, but we've got a little bit of a story to tell. So let's begin. It was 1943 when this B-24 was off the assembly line, probably at the Ford plant. It had just been assigned to the 514th Bomb Squadron. The squadron was part of the 376th Bombardment Group Heavy, and it was based in the desert country of Libya. Saluk Air Base, actually it was called. It was not that far from Benghazi. The airplane's given name, Lady Be Good, was hand-painted. It was hand-painted as nose art. It was also on the fuselage. No one really knows who came up with the name, but at the time there was a song in a movie, a motion picture, that was very popular, and that's probably how it got its famous name. Now, the Lady Be Good was new, and so was her crew. They had literally just arrived in Libya a week before the airplane was delivered. Let's talk about the crew. We had pilot Lieutenant William J. Hatton. He had just been married 6 months before. We had co-pilot Toner, Robert F. Toner. He was originally turned down by the Army Air Corps for poor vision, but he made it. He wanted to serve his country. We had a navigator, D.B. Hayes. He had been a bank teller before enlisting. We're going to talk about him. He has been named kind of by others as the Doodler. John S. Warovka was the bombardier. Radio operator was Robert Lamont. Robert was an avid outdoorsman. Next was Guy Shelley. Guy had overcome a childhood polio bout to become a flight engineer and gunner. Flight engineer Harold Ripslinger was next. He was a star high school athlete, and he was engaged to be married after the war, like many of the young men. Vernon Moore was the youngest of the crew at 21. He had a lifelong fascination for aircraft, and he found himself as a flight engineer and gunner, as many of them had the shared position. And last but not least, and whose grave we are walking towards today here in Eureka, is that man named Samuel Adams. Sam had a wife back here and a son in town as they went on their first mission. They would be one of 25 B-24s, and they were assigned to bomb the harbor of Naples, Italy, late in the afternoon of April 4th. It was a two-part attack that they were participating in. A flight of 12 B-24s would go first, followed by a second wave of 13, which included the Lady Be Good. After the attack, all of the airplanes were returning. Actually, as it turned out, the Lady Be Good, I need to explain how this works. She was part of that big group, but right after takeoff, because they're in the desert, you'd have the first plane take off in clean air on one side of the runway, and then the next on the other side, and the rest of the planes would just take off in the dust. And a lot of that sand would get in the carburetors and all. If you know about radial engines, which I know many of you don't, they're, you know, the sand is just coming right in. They're air-cooled engines. Well, the cylinders cool the engines, but the carburetor is just drawing all that air in. And there are filters, but the sand just devastates. So at the end of the day, the Lady Be Good was, I think there were 4 left, and she was in the lead, because when planes drop out, I mean, first mission, she's in the back, but as the planes drop out, Lady Be Good became the lead plane of a total of 4. And when they got to the site, it was dark, the bombing objective, and the captain made the decision to abort. He did not want to kill innocent people on the ground and miss the target. So they went back. They all turned around, and all the ships would make it home safely in the late of the night, except the Lady Be Good. The Lady Be Good would not make it, and would not be seen for decades later. Some beautiful old stones here, going back to the early 1800s. These are stones probably from pioneers, people that settled this country. There were some clues. There were some clues going on as they look back and tried to piece together why she did not return. There was a report that Lieutenant William Hatton radioed to say that his ADF wasn't working, and he was looking for a location back to the base. And basically the way it works, gang, is an ADF is a directional finder. It's basically like a needle that hones in on a beacon, okay? Like a compass. It finds, you know, you put on a certain frequency, and there's a tower somewhere of 50 or 100 miles away, and it's putting out, you know, a radio signal, and it's going that way, it's that way. So it wasn't working properly, but they were able to get a hold of one of the stations that was putting out signal. It was very close to Saluk, the base. And they said, yeah, you are, and it's basically to get a bearing, like a directional bearing. Now here's the trick. The beacon doesn't know, or the signal doesn't know, if you're that side of it or that side of it, if you're on a direction. It just knows, it's just giving you a bearing. And mysteriously, well, unmysteriously, what had probably happened is when they were confirming their direction back to Saluk with that operator, he said, yeah, you're on the right heading, 330. Let's go. Except they probably had flown over it already and they were going past it. From over the Mediterranean into the desert. Now when you're flying at night, even today, you know, we have GPS today, we have all this good stuff. They didn't have any of that. They're looking out the window. If you're on instruments, you're keeping the plane level and going by radio signals. So they're looking out and it's black. Whether it's ocean or whether it's desert, it all looks the same, especially on a moonless night, which this was. So they are lost. They still have good fuel left and they're running along, and you know, they're essentially running out of time. And on, and they're looking down and they're looking down, and you know, hazy weather. The desert is below freezing at night, over 100 degrees during the day. So I'm sure they're getting all kinds of weird haze, but they thought they were over the ocean. And finally the airplane, you know, they had fuel, you know, they were running out of gas. Finally they got to that point where, hey guys, and they started to bring it down, and the plan was to bail out over the ocean. Well, they didn't know it, of course. As I said, they were over the desert. And one of the worst parts of the desert, not the sand dunes that you usually see, not that that's any better, but this was the windless, flat, barren, absolutely desolate of desolate deserts. This part, the worst part. So they bailed out. You know, the clues would later say, we'll talk about. And, well, that's basically the last people heard. And it was the clues later that were put together, and I'll explain. Let's fast forward to 1958, how they figured a lot of this out. So the first reported sighting of the crash site was November 9th, 1958. It was by, you've all heard of BP Amoco. At the time it was BP, British oil exploration team working for BP. And their team did contact authorities. They said, hey, we see something here. So they contacted Wheeler Air Force Base, but Wheeler said, we don't have any reports of anybody going down anywhere near that area, so it's got to be something else or somebody else. We're not going to pursue this. However, the oil people put it on the map, and it was kind of a cool anomaly. And on we go. Now we go about a year later or so, February 27th, 1959, BP again. We've got Gordon Bowerman and British geologists Donald Sheridan and John Martin spot the wreckage. They're following up on the first sighting. And they put together a recovery team to go to the crash site. Look, I want to check this out. And wouldn't you? I would be the first there to go on that expedition. And they found it. They looked off in the distance. There it was. They finally got to it. And the first thing they observed is the plane was in pretty good shape. It was broken in two pieces, but considering it was basically immaculate. And The machine guns were still working. The radio was still working. And there was food and water on there, which was a little perplexing and alarming. They found a thermos of tea. It was still drinkable, but no human remains were found. Nothing. But they did find the evidence that the men had bailed out. That was pretty easy to determine. And one way is, I'll just tell you why right now, is, you know, I owned a TBM Avenger up until 3+ years ago. And I wore a parachute. Well, it saved my life. But the way the parachutes are set up, I had a simulated World War II configuration, is the parachute itself is like a seat pad, and you sit on it. And the seats in the plane, they're like metal buckets. You really can't sit in them. They're designed for the parachutes. Well, in these planes, it's for the pilot and the co-pilot only. Everybody else had their parachutes in bags. Anyway, they found, you know, first thing they do, they go to the cockpit, and there's nothing. Just metal, empty seat buckets. And then strewn about the cabin, they found those canvas bags. So they're like, oh, these guys bailed out. And then they found the logbook of the navigator, Hayes. It was still on board. And what was really eerie and weird is it made no mention of the aircraft's movements after they had left Naples. When they turned around, it was like blank. So the question is, you know, many still hypothesize to this day, was he sick? Did he have air sickness? Was he just, you know, doodles? Was he fumbling? Was he doodling? Was he just a passenger along for the ride, goofing off? My theory is he possibly could have been hit by shrapnel. Why would he be doodling off and being a passenger? This Brit, I think it was a British guy, theorized. I mean, you want to get home, and this is dangerous. So you'd be all over the navigation, not sitting along for the ride. I think that's the most preposterous theory that I've ever practically heard. But carrying on the story, it was interesting. You know, I have a feeling he was injured. Other interesting evidence showed that one of the engines was still operating at the time of impact, and that would suggest that the aircraft gradually lost altitude at a very shallow descent rate. You know, doesn't have to be on the autopilot if things are trimmed out pretty well, which means that all the flight control surfaces out there, you know, the we call them, you know, the ailerons, basically all the surfaces on the airplane. You see there's a trim tab on the elevator and on the ailerons, which the ailerons turn the plane and the elevator makes the tail go up and down. And simply put, the trim tab you adjust so that you can take your hands off the wheel and it'll just fly perfectly. Well, for a while. Kind of like an autopilot, but not really going anywhere. So given that situation, if you look back on it, piece it together, if that engine was still going and it was trimmed out, which means also the rudder has trim tab, so that would be trimmed for one engine, which would be hard left or right, that plane would, and they bailed out, and the plane just descended into the desert and landed on its belly. It's really hard to believe, but that is precisely what happened. So the U.S. Army finally sent in searchers once they had the wreck identified there. It was a mortuary team, and they looked through the wreck and they put a lot of this information together. Great. And they were smart guys. They went out and they started searching the perimeter. They were doing a sweep. And finally, the first thing they found were 2 black boots. And they're like, okay, we're on track here. we have an idea what may have happened or where they may be. And then they discovered these truck prints. Now, if you can believe this, imagine truck prints from, well, if you went from 1943 or 42, 43, depending when those the truck prints were in the early 1940s, let's just say that. It was like on the moon, where they were still there, 1959, 1960. Can you imagine? So they're like, what would you do if you were these men and you broke trail of these tracks? You'd follow them. You're like, these have to go back to civilization, right? So very smartly they followed them. But sadly, it just took them to the area of the desert that had the monster sand dunes that are ever shifting. So they said, they looked up the sand dune and they said, well, they're probably buried in there under 10 feet of sand. We'll never find them. So the mission was called off. But the next year, when everything was exhausted and everyone gave up, the remains started to become found. And as it usually happens from time to time in these situations, it occurs by accident. And on February 11th, 1960, good old BP Oil research team, you know, they weren't looking for the Lady Be Good crew, but they were looking for seismic data from rock formations, and they crossed between two huge big sand dunes, a valley, and there in the middle could be plainly seen an anomaly of rags and bones. White skeletons embedded halfway in the sand. It must have been quite an eerie sight. And around them, empty canteens, flashlights, shoes, all their stuff. And the most interesting and, I would say, scary thing, haunting thing, is they found hoods made from the parachutes. And they had eyes cut out, kind of like the ghost. And you could only imagine they were using that to protect their bodies and heads from the sun. When you go that long, many days, all of the moisture and liquid from your body, as it becomes evaporated away, sucked away through your skin, if you will, and you don't get any new nutrients, your eyes go. And why do your eyes go? Well, your eyes need moisture. Can you imagine walking blind? Can't open your eyes in the desert. You talk about horror. What a way to go. Well, that's what happened. He found the diary on one of those 5 men, Robert Toner, co-pilot. It was in the pocket of his flight suit overalls. The pages were perfectly preserved. It was like going back in time. You could read, you could understand what these poor men had to endure, and everything I just told you, it was written in there. Absolutely harrowing to read. And I will put a link for a book that you should get if you're interested in this story. Scroll down in the description box. I can tell you, again, firsthand, it's much worse. Now, with the news that the 5 bodies had been recovered, the U.S. Air Force went into major action with the U.S. Army. They started an expanded search called Operation Climax in May of 1960. But again, it would be BP Oil exploration folks. And the first they would find would be Guy E. Shelley. On May 12th, 1960, he was 24 miles northwest of the Five Bodies. And this is really eerie, gang. He was climbing. It was just like the initial Army mortuary team. He ran into the big dune. He was by himself, and he tried to climb it. It must have been 100, 200 feet high. And if you've climbed, I've done this in Indiana State Dunes for fun, with the kids climb those dunes, your feet sink in. It's like almost impossible. He made it almost to the top. And that is where he collapsed and died. And they said that they found his bones from there, spread all the way down to the bottom. And that's from just all the winds and erosion and nature doing its thing. But I found that particularly eerie. A U.S. helicopter found the body of Sergeant Harold Ripslinger on May 17, 1960. He was 26 miles northwest of Shelley's body, over 200 miles from the crash site, only 99 miles from their airbase at Saluk. These two bodies were the only ones found during Operation Climax. And it would be another British petroleum oil exploration crew that discovered, finally, the remains of Second Lieutenant John S. Waravka in August of 1960. His body was recovered by the U.S. Air Force eventually. We are here. We've arrived at the Adams family plot. Well, really, it's not a family plot. We have his mom and dad with him on the right here. His mother, Lucy, who was born in 1898 and passed in 1982. And we'll step over here. Father, Mars A., born the same year and passed just 4 years after the end of the war. In his lower 50s. And here is the grave of Samuel Ellis Adams. Right here. Staff Sergeant 376, Bomb Group, World War II. October 25, 1919, April 13th, 1943, and there's a nice American Legion marker here. If you see these guys, then you know what that means. I'm sure he had a beautiful flag here with the other veterans earlier this summer. I am going to place a penny here. Well, it was quite a mission, and you have to give all these brave men credit. I call them what has been said over and over, the greatest generation. It's my favorite term because I believe it. And Samuel and the rest of the men were an example of that. They gave their lives for our country, for the freedom of the world. So Samuel Ellis Adams, rest in peace.